Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at Tamiya's brand new 1/72 scale Grumman F-14D Tomcat. I've been waiting for this one for a while, so let's see what it's all about. We begin the Tomcat in the cockpit, putting in the rear bulkheads, swiftly followed by the side mounted control panels. You'll notice that everything slots and clips into place with very positive fitment. And it also follows a very similar build-up pattern to the 1/48 scale version of this kit. But please don't be fooled, there are differences between this 72nd scale version and the 48th scale version. I quickly move on to building up the pilot and the Rio. The only difference between the two figures is the arm positions, the pilot being able to grab on to the control column. I then build up both of the ejection seats, once again minor differences in the top part of the ejection seat. Once the ejection seats were built, that was the majority of the cockpit assemblies all done and dusted. It then received a generous coating of Mr. Finishing Surfaces 1500 black as a priming base, and then I could start to black base the colour on top of it. And the colour which I'm using here is Mr. Colours C363, which is medium sea grey. With the base now being sprayed down, I could do a little bit of detail painting, and to do this, I tried out AK's paint pens. I quite like them, but I don't think they're going to replace my paintbrushes just yet, and that's because I think I've got a little bit more control with the paintbrush, although these are really convenient and quite easy to use. With the main colours now blocked in, I gave the cockpit a coating of GX100. This sealed in the paintwork before applying the decals. The decals themselves have really good detail on them and look great once applied. The only trouble is getting them to conform around all of the lovely detail which is already raised on the surface. To do this, I had to use quite a lot of setting and softening solutions. With the other panels now secured within the cockpit, I can move on to doing a little bit of weathering. After another layer of GX100 had been applied, I could put down a black panel line wash. This is hopefully going to accentuate a couple of the recessed details within the cockpit and also on the pilot. Any excess wash which was sitting on the surface can be blended in using a flat-headed brush. Once the wash was dry, I could seal everything in using a VMS matte varnish. This gave me a really good base to then do some dry brushing to hopefully bring out a few more of those raised details on a couple of the black aspects within the cockpit and also on the ejection seats. Although I love how the matte varnish looks, some areas need that gloss varnish to make them look a little bit more 3D. So over the screens and the visors, I dolloped on some GX100 straight from the bottle. With the Rio and the pilot cemented down, that pretty much completes the F-14 cockpit. And I must say, this was one of the most in-depth and detailed 1/72nd kits I've ever done, but it was an absolute joy to put together. I can now move on to building up the front wheel well, before the cockpit assembly is cemented on top. This assembly can now be cemented into one side of the front nose. It demonstrates some nice pins and lugs so you ensure a positive fitment within the assemblies. After this, the final aspects of the cockpit can be cemented on. There are a couple of panels which have to be cemented into position, which are individual to the D variant, which makes me think that potentially in the future we're going to be seeing the A version of this kit. I can now turn my attention to building up the main body of the Tomcat, initially starting off with these intake ramps. With the ramps in position, I can now have a look at building up the main wheel wells. These have a great jig-esque mechanism which is really satisfying to put together. One thing which I absolutely love about Tamiya kits is the implementation of polycaps, and this one is no exception. 2 polycaps need to be cemented in at the rear in their holders for the horizontal stabilizers. Another lovely bit of engineering here from Tamiya is the sweep wing mechanism. This is identical to how it works on the 48th version, but just scaled down to 72nd. I was now in a position to cement the top half of the fuselage to the bottom half of the fuselage to make it look like a weird square pancake, but that's what I love about the F-14, such a unique shape. I can now continue on my conquest by building up the iconic twin intakes. With the intakes now secured, I can go around the rest of the airframe, building up all the odds and sods. It is at this stage that I can make the nose with the main fuselage, and it just slides into place like butter. It is absolutely incredible, this level of engineering on 1/72nd scale. I'm at a point now where I'm just trying to get the Tomcat ready for priming, so trying to get as much onto the airframe so that I don't have to muck around with sub-assemblies later on in the build. This includes the pod under the nose, the horizontal and vertical stabilizers, these pylons, and anything else which can go onto the airframe at this stage and doesn't have to be left as a sub-assembly. One thing that stood in the way of me and getting some paint onto this Tomcat was the seam on the canopy. Initially I scraped it off with a fresh blade and then went through a load of sanding grits, before finally polishing it to give me a nice clear canopy without the seam. To get the best results out of your models, like polishing canopies, you need specialised tools. Hannants London is my local model shop, supplying me with all my tools you see in the videos, and they can do the same for you. Open all weekend, it works out for a great trip to come grab all your tools and projects, and also get some references next door in the RAF Museum. Links are below. Whilst I was mucking around with transparencies, I thought it was a good opportunity to put some holographic film on the heads-up display for the pilot, and also tint that front canopy transparent blue as well. I could then use the included masking set, which has to be cut out, to mask off the canopies. These are secured using Amomig's Ultra Glue to prevent any potential frosting that might happen. Now with the canopies secured, everything can be primed in Mr. Finishing Surfaces 1500 Black, before I can then go on to do the pre-shading effect, and that is going to be doing an ink patina. This uses acrylic ink and X20A. X20A is initially used to kind of break up the surface and relieve any surface tension. The ink is then brushed onto this wing before using a brush doused in a little bit of X20A to start stippling until it's dry. This produces a marble effect, as you'll see on screen now. Here you can see what it looks like once it's dry. A brilliant base to then work off of for that sun bleach effect that loads of US Navy jets have. To begin the painting, I'm going to be using Mr. Colour's C306 for the overall colour. After looking at lots of reference images of these Tomcats in use, although they're meant to be a couple of different tones of grey, once they've been out in the sun for a while, it all blends into one colour. Now, when I'm spraying down the actual colour, what I'm trying to do is only mist the colour on. If I go too heavy, I'll completely obliterate that ink patina effect and it will all be pointless. So taking my time here and making sure I'm only slowly building up that tone. This was the result after a couple of passes over the airframe, and I was happy that that was the general tone that I was looking for. Now I can start to break up that paint a little bit more, as it currently looks a bit monotone. To do this, I've added about 10 to 20% of white into Mr. Colour's C306 to give me a slightly more bleached out version of that paint. I'm now going to go around all the edges of panels and certain access panels which might be getting high use. Around the wing, sometimes I just did blotches of this lightened version to indicate paint touch-ups where potentially the paint had been corroded by the salt water. This was a result that I was left with, and I was very happy with how broken up and blotchy the airframe looked. Now that I was happy with my corroded grey base, I can start to pick out a couple of the other aspects of this scheme which I wanted to do, and that's going to be Scheme C. It is a low-vis Tomcat, but it does have a couple of black aspects along with metallics which need to be painted on. Now, when having a look at references for the Tomcat, specifically the D variant, I noticed that the exhausts are this lovely burnished goldy tint. To recreate this, I've used Mr. Color's Superfine Silver 2 with a couple of drops of brass into the mix. This made sure that it stayed pretty muted and not too gold and in your face. After this, I could use all the masking tape that I had on hand to mask off each of the individual fillets on the exhaust. These could then be sprayed NATO black. I used some pigments on the inner of the exhaust just to give a little bit more of a sooty feel, and then they were finished. After the exhaust cans were fitted, I could go around the rest of the aircraft putting on a couple of the sub-assemblies which had been left on for ease of painting, but I wanted them on the model for the gloss varnish to make sure everything gets a unifying, uniform coat. This gave me a great base to get the decals onto this airframe. Like in the cockpit, they were quite thick and quite hard to work with, but I did manage to get them down. My only gripe was midway through I heard an almighty crack, looked on the left shoulder, and I had split the seam. Every modeller's worst nightmare. Unfortunately, it was too late for me to go back and blend it all in, so I just had to live with it and move on to weathering the Tomcat. Weathering for this build was going to be really simple as most of it was done through the ink patina. I used Ammo Mig's black panel line wash all over the aircraft to give a level of grit and grime. With my decals in place and my subtle weathering complete, I can start to bring everything together, initially starting off by cementing the two airbags in position. There are two variants here, one for if your wings are going to be extended or swept back. I'm personally going to have mine swept back, and I'll make sure I use the corresponding airbags. The wings can then be slotted into position as well, and swept back into their final resting position. One thing I did manage to miss was these two vents having to be sprayed in a metallic colour, so it was a quick job of masking them off and getting them all sprayed up. After that, everything was coated in its final varnish, and that was VMS's matte varnish, and I think this really brought the Tomcat into scale. It just looks so good without that glossy sheen on it. Now, not wasting any time, I move on to building up the landing gear legs. All of the landing gear legs have these really strong locating lugs, which make sure that you get the angle and the fitment bang on first time. Another really enjoyable feature of this kit are the landing gear doors. Instead of just having two spindly prongs which you need to try and slot into a certain position, they have actual rectangular slats which fit into the sides of the landing gear walls. It is so smart and makes fitting landing gear doors so easy. The horizontal stabilizers are secured into position with no glue, making use of those polycaps before cementing on the great range of ordnance that this kit has. I personally opted for 4 GBUs, 2 AIM-7s, 2 AIM-9s and 1 AIM-7. My goodness, I'm not good with missiles. The missiles and ordnance in general are so well detailed for 72nd scale. The only thing I ended up doing was adding the thermal paste texture with some Mr. Finishing Surfacer on the GBU-12s, but that was really only an additional extra. The Tomcat could then be flipped over, masking removed, and the canopy receives a final polish. After this, it is placed into position, and that finishes up this build. So thank you very much for watching. I really do hope that you've enjoyed this build. It is an incredible kit, especially for 72nd, and just highlights how impressive Tamiya's engineering is in this day and age. Also, from me, I hope you've had a very happy holidays, and also I'd like to thank you for such an incredible year on the channel. Anyway, without any further ado, enjoy the final photos and videos, and I'll see you next time, guys. Bye bye.
Flying 180, Eagles 8, heading 330.